I grew up in a house where silence spoke louder than words. My father believed that order was the foundation of love, that a family without rules was a family without meaning. I remember the smell of varnished wood in our living room, the polished clock that ticked with military precision, and the way my father's shoes always rested neatly beneath the old coat rack. Every object had its place, every sound had its purpose. He wasn't cruel, not in the way people often describe cruelty. He was precise, consistent, and frighteningly calm. His words never rose, but his silence could bend the air around us. I used to sit at the dining table, small hands folded, waiting for him to finish reading the newspaper before I could take a bite. My mother would pretend not to notice how tense I was, her eyes flicking toward me with quiet pity. There were rules for everything. Lights off by 9. Shoes aligned by the door. Speak only when spoken to. And never, never lie. He called these principles of character, but to me they were the invisible bars around my childhood. One evening, I remember spilling milk on the table. Just a small mistake, the kind every child makes. But the silence that followed was unbearable. The clock kept ticking, and my father's face remained unreadable. He didn't yell. He just folded his paper, stood, and said quietly, "Go to your room. You've broken the rule of carelessness." That was how he punished me, with distance. No shouting, no hand raised, just absence. It was like being erased for a day. At 10 years old, I started learning that fear didn't need noise. It could live inside stillness, like a ghost that never left the room. There was something almost sacred about my father's presence. I wanted to make him proud. I wanted his nod of approval. The rare moment when he'd say, "Good, that's how a man behaves." But the harder I tried to follow his rules, the more I felt I was losing myself. Once, at school, my teacher asked us to write about our heroes. Most kids wrote about soldiers, actors, or mothers. I wrote about my father. I wrote that he never lies, never laughs, and never forgets. When the teacher read it aloud, the class went quiet. I thought she would praise me, but her face looked strange, almost sad. When I came home that day, my father was waiting. He had already received a call from the teacher. He asked to read my essay. After finishing, he said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "Don't ever tell others about this house. Some things are not for the world to know." That night I understood that my home wasn't just ruled by discipline, it was built on secrecy. Sometimes I'd stand outside my parents' room and listen to them talk in hushed tones, my mother's voice soft and trembling, his firm and sharp. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the rhythm of authority when I heard it. It was the same rhythm that echoed inside me. As the years passed, I started to notice small cracks in my father's perfect system. The way his hands sometimes trembled when he poured his tea. The way he'd stare at the family photo in the hallway, lost in a memory I couldn't enter. I didn't know it then, but the rules weren't protecting him. They were holding him together. And I was becoming a reflection of him. Quiet, controlled, afraid to breathe wrong. That winter, the lesson that would break me began, not with anger, but with disappointment. It started with one mistake, one lie, that I thought would keep the peace. But in my father's world, peace built on lies was a sin. That was the night I learned what discipline really meant. Not obedience, not respect, but surrender.
It happened in winter, one of those nights when the air felt too heavy to breathe. I was 13, old enough to know better, young enough to still believe that small lies could save me from big punishments. That evening, my father asked me if I had finished polishing his shoes. I hadn't. I had been outside, playing in the snow with my friend Daniel. But when he looked at me with those cold gray eyes, the truth froze in my throat. "Yes, Father," I said. The words slipped out so smoothly, it scared me. He nodded once, and I thought I was safe. But the truth has a way of living in the walls, waiting. Later that night, I heard the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Steady, deliberate. The same rhythm I'd known since I could walk. The door opened without a sound. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. He simply held up his shoes. They were still covered in dried mud. "Did you lie to me?" he asked. The question wasn't a demand. It was an opening. A single door to redemption. I could have stepped through. I could have said yes. But fear has its own gravity. It pulled me deeper into silence. "No, Father." His eyes didn't move, but I felt them cut through me. "Truth," he said softly, "is what makes a man. Without it, he's nothing." He turned, left the room, and I thought the storm had passed. But my father's punishments never came in the moment. They came like winter frost, slowly, quietly, freezing everything in their path. The next morning, he didn't speak to me. Not at breakfast, not after school, not when we passed each other in the hallway. He was there, but absent, present in the silence that wrapped the house like fog. It was worse than anger. It was exile. Days turned into weeks. Every time I tried to speak, his eyes told me not to. He would hand me my lunch, without a word, gesture toward the table, then go back to his chair by the window. Even my mother avoided his gaze, as though afraid the silence might spread to her too. At night, I could hear the faint sound of him pacing in the living room. His steps echoed through the wooden floorboards like a metronome, slow and heavy. I started counting them to fall asleep. Then one evening, I broke. I couldn't take the distance anymore. I went to his room. He was sitting there, polishing his shoes. The same pair. The leather gleamed like glass. "Father," I said, voice trembling, "I'm sorry." He didn't look up. "For what?" The words caught in my chest. It wasn't just about the shoes anymore. It was about every time I had failed to meet his impossible standard. Every rule I'd obeyed without understanding why. Every moment I had been too afraid to simply be myself. "I'm sorry for lying," I whispered. He stopped polishing, his hands still. The clock ticked. The silence grew heavy. Finally, he said, "When a man lies, he chooses fear over truth. You feared me more than you respected me." I didn't mean to. He raised his hand, not to strike me, but to silence me. His voice stayed calm. "You will learn what honesty costs." He told me I was to stay in my room for a week. No dinner with the family, no radio, no conversation. Just me, alone, with my thoughts. At first it felt unfair. Then it felt unbearable. By the third day, I began talking to myself. By the fourth, I wasn't sure what was worse, his anger or his absence. The silence became a weight pressing on my chest, shaping my breath, my heartbeat, my guilt. When the week finally ended, he called me to the dining table. My mother sat across, quiet and pale. "Do you understand why I did this?" he asked. I nodded, but the truth was, I didn't really. I only understood the feeling of being small, ashamed, and unseen. He placed his hand on the table and said, "Someday you'll thank me. The world is cruel to men who cannot control themselves." He believed he was saving me. I wanted to believe it too. That night, as I lay awake, I thought about his words. I thought about how love, when mixed with fear, stops feeling like love at all. And I wondered, If this was what becoming a man meant, then maybe I didn't want to grow up. By the time I turned 17, the silence between us had become its own language. We spoke through gestures, looks, the scraping of chairs, and the closing of doors. My father didn't yell. He didn't need to. His disappointment filled the room before he even entered it. He believed in control, of words, of emotions, of everything. And I was the constant reminder that control could be broken. That year, I started working part-time at the local gas station. It wasn't much, but it gave me something he couldn't take away. A few hours of freedom, a few moments where I could just exist, without being measured. One night, I came home late. Not much, maybe 15 minutes past curfew. The kind of mistake most fathers would sigh over. But not mine. He was waiting, in the dark, sitting in his usual chair by the window. A cigarette burned slowly between his fingers, the only light in the room. "You're late." His voice was calm, too calm. "I lost track of time," I said. He exhaled smoke and said, "That's how weak men start, losing track." Something inside me snapped then. Years of silence, punishment, and cold lessons boiled up. I couldn't keep swallowing it anymore. "I'm not weak, Father. I'm just tired of living like I'm one mistake away from being nothing." He didn't move, didn't blink, just looked at me, the way a judge looks at someone already guilty. "Respect," he said, "isn't optional. And neither is being human," I shot back. The words echoed, too loud, too fast. I had never spoken to him that way before. My hands were shaking, my throat dry, but something in me refused to stop. "You think silence makes a man strong? You think control makes him worthy? It doesn't. It just makes him lonely." He stood up then, slowly. The chair creaked, the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. When he spoke, his voice was softer than I expected. "You don't understand. The world breaks soft men." "And what about fathers who break their sons first?" I asked. The air changed. Heavy, sharp. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger this time, but hurt. The kind of hurt he didn't know how to show, except by burying it deeper. He turned his face away. The silence stretched between us again, that old, familiar wall. Then, without a word, he walked out of the room. The sound of the door closing was quieter than I imagined, but it felt final. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the window, staring at the empty chair where he used to sit. The cigarette ash still lingered on the floor, a small gray ghost of our last argument. In that moment, I realized something that both comforted and terrified me. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been broken by his own father long before I ever existed. Discipline wasn't cruelty to him. It was inheritance, a curse passed down, father to son, disguised as love. And I was just the first one who dared to break it. It's strange how memory softens the edges of pain. When I think of my father now, I don't see the man who broke me. I see the man who never knew how to be whole. Years have passed. The house where we lived is gone, sold after he died. I found the keys to it in a rusted tin box, along with a few photographs, his old wristwatch, and a folded note written in his thin, rigid handwriting. The note said only this: "I was harder on you because I saw myself in you." That was it. No apology, no warmth, just truth, bare, stripped, unadorned. And somehow, it hurt more than any punishment he'd ever given me. I sat there for hours, turning that line over in my head. He saw himself in me, the same silence, the same anger, the same need for control. And maybe he thought if he could fix me, he could fix himself. But fathers don't fix sons by breaking them. They only teach them how to hide their pain better. I grew up cautious, always watching my tone, always second-guessing my worth. Even when I became a father myself, I caught the echoes of his voice in mine. Don't be late. Be respectful. Don't argue. Each time I'd stop halfway through a sentence and feel his shadow standing over me, cold, silent, unyielding. My son once asked me, "Dad, why do you always pause before you speak?" I told him, because I don't want to sound like my father. He didn't understand then. He just nodded the way kids do. But one night, not long ago, I caught myself sitting in the same chair my father once sat in, staring at the same kind of clock ticking too loudly on the wall. My son was late coming home. The air was thick with memory. For a few moments, I felt the old instinct rise, that urge to teach, to control, to silence. My hand even twitched toward the lamp switch, ready to wait in the dark, just like he used to. But I didn't. I turned on the light instead. When my son finally came in, breathless, apologizing, I looked at him and saw myself at 17, scared, defiant, confused, a boy desperate for approval, too proud to ask for it. And I said, quietly, "You're late, but you're home. Sit down." He did. We talked, not about respect or discipline or control, but about mistakes and how they don't define a man unless he keeps repeating them. For the first time, I felt like I'd rewritten something, like the chain had finally broken. Later that night, I found the old note again. I tore it in half, not out of anger, but out of release. The sound of the paper ripping felt like an exorcism, the end of a language I'd spent my whole life trying to unlearn. Now when I dream, I still hear my father's footsteps sometimes, those slow, heavy echoes down the hallway of my youth. But they don't frighten me anymore. Because I've learned something he never could. Silence doesn't make a man strong. Forgiveness does. And maybe, in some quiet corner of the universe, he's finally proud of me, not for obeying him, but for becoming the man he never had the chance to be.